Well, greetings, everybody. I am Nancy Easterbrook. I am Executive Director of Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm particularly excited for today's session, given who our speaker is. For those of you who aren't familiar with SVDX, I encourage you to go to our website, www.svdx.org. We offer education and networking programming for boards of directors. And throughout today's session, I encourage you to submit your questions on the Q&A button on Zoom. And really, I don't want to waste any time with an introduction, a very long, lengthy introduction, because I know we want to hear from our speaker today, who I feel really needs no introduction. If you're familiar with SVDX, Joe has been a partner in bringing good content to our community for many, many years now. So Joe Grundfest is the W.A. Franke Professor of Law and Business at Stanford Law School. He's also faculty and co-founder of the Arthur and Tony Rembe Rock Center for Corporate Governance. And additionally, our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is also a co-founder of the Arthur and Tony Rembe Rock Center for Corporate Governance. So we have a little bit of a theme here. Dan also sits on many boards. He is vice chair of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and chairman of SVDX. It's always a thrill to hear these two in conversation. And so I don't want to waste any more time, but just say thank you so much, Joe, for joining us today. And we're looking forward to today's session.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. So I'm going to jump right in, but first I'm going to answer a question I get all the time, which is, hey, Dan, who's in that picture over your shoulder? Sometimes I'm actually in my office. Sometimes it's a green screen. Today it's a green screen. And as it happens, it's Simon Lorne and Joe Grundfest. Joe's the one in the middle. So I'm always excited to have him here. That was taken to the Directors College years ago. Joe, we don't need to really introduce the topic other than to say we're going to kind of do a compare and contrast. What should be the takeaways? What are the lessons learned between Theranos and Headspin, and what is your view about what happened and how it happened and why? But I first want to make an observation and throw it to you to explain. And the observation is, it seems to me that Theranos collected quite a menagerie of great directors, right? There was one of every kind that you would want. And the one that they were missing was an outstanding, famous former SEC commissioner. And it'd be great if he actually was an academic with prominence in corporate governance. So what happened? Why weren't you on the Theranos board?
Well, it wasn't because Elizabeth didn't try. So it's a fascinating story, but Elizabeth did ask me to have a conversation with her about potentially serving on the Theranos board. And I think it's fair to say she and I were not a fit. She didn't get past my due diligence filter. And there are some fascinating stories about, how and why I just figured I was not going to get along with her and didn't want to have any piece of it. Basically, she and I, we had a bunch of friends and acquaintances in common. I was introduced to her. We had a few conversations, and we then ran into each other at Books Incorporated over in Town and Country Village, over close to Stanford. And I was with my wife, and Carol and I are talking, and Carol's got a background in the biosciences. She's a biochemist. She's done drug development, knows a whole bunch about blood testing and the like. And, we chat with Elizabeth for about 5 minutes, perfectly cordial. We walk out of the store, and Carol turns to me and she says, Joe, she's a liar. Just flat out, there you go. And I kind of go, oh, that's interesting. Why do you say that? She gave many reasons. I'm not going to repeat all of them. But, two things that she said I think were extraordinarily salient. First, she said, look, you can't do all the blood tests that she's talking about using the technology, the microfluidics that she's pumping, all right? And there aren't any patents out there about the stuff that she's claiming. So what is it? I mean, she says she can do something. If you know anything about the science and the like, you can't do this with that. The pieces don't mesh. And the second part of it, I thought was really particularly additionally insightful. She said, look, in this business, experience is not a substitute for intelligence, and intelligence is not a substitute for experience. You can have an IQ of 160, and still, you just haven't been around long enough to know how the world works in order to be able to make this stuff work. Maybe you can do it with software, all right? Sure, okay, fine. But when you're talking about, blood testing and FDA approval and everything else that goes along with that, it helps to have been around the block a few times, all right, before thinking you can actually build a company and make it work. Well, needless to say, Carol turned out to be entirely right. I'm used to that phenomenon. Dan, you've met Carol. Don't bet against her. She's absolutely right. Virtually.
That's right.
No, it's true. And then, just to fast forward, Elizabeth, invites me to have a conversation about potentially serving on the board. I ask a couple of questions that are not terribly sophisticated, all right, at all, and it doesn't go well. So, for example, I ask questions about your IP strategy. What's your plan? I mean, what about the patents that you're going to file and everything? Where are they in process? And he says, nah, we're not going to rely much on patents. And I just said, what? She says, well, we're going to rely a lot on trade secret. I go, well, in your line of business, relying on trade secret, that kind of stuff, kind of dangerous. She goes, no, but that's the path that we're going to follow. Well, it turns out she's following that path. She doesn't have anything patentable. All right. And well, all right, if you're going to go with trade secret, I assume that you're going to be able to disclose to me what these trade secrets are, how they're working, so I can help with strategy and my fiduciary obligation. She says, no, the board doesn't need to know that. So, right away, I'm kind of going like, wait a minute. I'm a cesspool for material non-public information. I'm a lawyer, right? I know people's deepest, darkest secrets, and people share everything with me. And you won't share that with me, and you want me to be on your board? Not a good way to be developing trust, my friend. So we agree to have another meeting. And this time I come prepared with questions where Carol has coached me and said, look, here are the regulatory issues you're going to run into. Here's some of the scientific issues. And I had a list of 10 questions that I memorized. All right. And said, well, all right, if she can pass these questions, then we'll take it seriously. So that's the first question, it had to do about regulatory strategy and the like. And the answer that I got, to this day reminded me of like an overweight chicken attempting desperately to fly. And it was not going well. It was just terrible. So I go to the second question, give her another shot. And I get like a Marceau pantomime, deflecting, doing everything she possibly can, not to lie to me, but not to answer the question at the same time. So I get another shot. I get the third question, all right? And again, it's this flailing around and obfuscation. And, you think back on it, I say, look, I can't say she lied to me, but I will tell you I did not get a straight answer to any question that I asked. So, after those three questions, I said, let's be polite. I said, how about those San Francisco 49ers? Do you think they're going to solve their problems with the offensive line this year? So we talked football for a while, okay? And, there you go.
And the rest is sort of history, right? I mean, that's a fascinating story. You had two big advantages. One, Carol. Let's acknowledge that. I'll give you credit for having dodged a bullet even without her, but it would have been a closer call. So you have Carol. Second, your job kind of day to day is to kind of ask questions, establish whether someone, is being honest, whether they do or don't know things. And in the educational world, that last question to her, the softball about sports, was the kindness you exhibit to students who are flailing. That's your job. So you kind of had two big advantages, and you dodged a bullet. And yet it was still a pretty sophisticated campaign, Joe, to recruit you. And you kind of underplay it, but I kind of know some of the story. It was persistent and ingenious and hard hitting. And so
if you're going to run a securities fraud, who better to put on your board than a former SEC commissioner? I mean, come on. All right. No, at that level, yeah, I get it.
And that brings us to the segue. Although actually, I'm going to ask you a two-part question. I was about to say, hey, when this story went down, many stakeholders kind of, excuse the pun, wanted, blood from the board. And yet the board was essentially found, not liable. And the same thing with Headspin. But before we get into that difference, I wonder if
two very, very different.
So I was going to ask you to expand on that, especially the Headspin difference. So maybe lay out a little bit about Headspin, so not everyone will be as familiar with it.
Well, wait, why don't you explain I feel like I've been doing all the talking.
Well, you're a better talker than I am. I'll do the 30-second version, which is...
You tell the Headspin story and I can comment on it.
Well, I'll give the bare bones, which is in the classic story that we find in Silicon Valley. You have a sophisticated but charismatic young entrepreneur CEO who really pulls people into his thrall, and over time starts overstating performance. And then over time, crosses very much the line of not just kind of overstating the expectations of performance, but exaggerating that performance in real time. And then kind of the coup de grace was forging documents, creating fake invoices, essentially ballooning up, and doing that in conjunction with fundraising efforts, right? So you have kind of all the elements that come together that are way, way, way beyond the starry-eyed, charismatic entrepreneur hoping and describing a future that's rosier than most of us think it will be, but rather cross the line. So and then the board does some things.
Let me just step back and comment on one thing. One of the things that I hear from people that I just kind of, look, you don't understand how Silicon Valley works. It's like they believe that everything is permitted because Silicon Valley operates on the principle of fake it till you make it. No, in the amount of time I have to spend with reporters and other people going, no, that's a popular thing for you to say, but it's just nonsense. Now, wherever you think that line is between optimism, irrational optimism, and fraud, you know that you have crossed that line by the time that you are falsifying sales documents and inflating key metrics and making those falsified documents with the key metrics available to investors who are going to be buying stock at an inflated value because you are a liar. All right. Now, that crosses the line. The line probably exists at some point before that. All right. So stipulated. But by the time you're doing that, all right, doctoring documents, you're toast. You're gone. That's not Elizabeth.
And we have
gone.
Yeah, and so they're similar stories, but they have like very different material facts. But both boards essentially escape liability. Can you give us a quick rundown of why that is the case, and if you sense that that was the appropriate outcome? And then I'd love for you to outline the different behaviors between the two boards, and maybe compare and contrast the responsiveness as almost lessons learned and advice that sitting directors should take. But first, the escaping of liability generally. Why is that, and what's your take on that?
Well, the intriguing thing is that the two boards, in my mind, wind up at opposite ends of the spectrum, and they're opposite ends of the spectrum that are then able to avoid liability. So on the one hand, in the Theranos board, the argument there is that they didn't know what was going on, right? We were lied to by management, and we reasonably relied on management. You can talk about whether their reliance was reasonable or not, given what we were able to figure out. And they therefore, had protections of business judgment rule and the like, and there you go. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the Headspin board that smelled a rat, conducted an internal investigation, figured out what was going on, fired the CEO, explained the entire situation to the Department of Justice and to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they wound up with no criminal proceeding against the company. They wound up with an injunction with the SEC, no penalty against the company, no action against the board of directors, an SEC release that in effect compliments the board of directors for doing the right thing. All right. They pay back the investors that wound up investing in the C round at an inflated value. They bring the valuations down. They fire the CEO. They do a restart on the senior management. All right. And then they move forward. They find the problem. They fix the problem. They give people the money back. They, in effect, recap the company and they move on. All right. So that's the Headspin story. The Theranos story is, hey, we didn't find it. It wasn't our fault, but they're going to jail. Oh, and by the way, the CEO of Headspin going to jail too. Not
Joe.
Yet.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah, we'll probably do something on that when that happens. A question, Joe. Something you say with some frequency, and I think it's a reality check for directors and their capabilities in detecting frauds. And you've been saying it since WorldCom and each time since, and that is, it is likely unrealistic for a hardworking, even smart and insightful independent director to detect a fraud early on, or even a little bit past early on, all things equal, especially if it's a sophisticated fraud, because they aren't there every day. That's not really what they do. And yet people have that expectation. And I think that creates kind of an unusual dynamic between expectations of board members and what they do and don't do and outcomes. But instead, and I want you to expand on this, boards will be unlucky and have a fraud detected. And when they do, their performance is more about what they do when they have a hint of a problem and how quickly they act versus having detected it earlier, which is in many ways just wishful thinking. So I wonder if you could itemize or tease out of the Headspin story what it is that made them exemplary in their behavior. Maybe it's the timing. Is it the depth they took? Was it the system that they had in place to get early warnings? What was it, combined that prompted the SEC to essentially say, hey, this was like best practice behavior in case of a bad thing?
Well, I think I would just describe it as responsible adult reaction as opposed to wishful thinking and trying to sweep something under the rug and hoping that the problem would go away. It's one thing if management successfully hides the problem from the board, right? And the board doesn't have what the courts often call a red flag, all right? That there's look, to me, it's an interesting question why the people who were on the board at Theranos didn't see the red flags. Among other things, you had one of their general counsel, all right, quit. Right, Mike Esquivel, he handled it exactly right. All right, he went to the board, he explained what the issues were. Board didn't respond. He said, "I'm not staying around with this. This is a fraud. I'm out of here." So he did what a responsible lawyer would do. He resigned. All right, interesting question, and this is a question that comes up in many corporations in many contexts, and that is, when do you self-report? When do you think you found a problem that's sufficiently serious that you should either start a significant investigation or you should go to the government and say, we have an issue? So this comes up not only in Silicon Valley when somebody's falsifying sales records and raising money based on false sales numbers, but if you find bribery at a company, if you have an FCPA problem, right? So, have our sales representatives in China, all right, bribed people in order to get us business. How strong does that evidence have to be before, you call a lawyer and you say, all right, we're going to spend millions of dollars on an internal investigation. And then how far along do you have to get in that process before you pick up the phone, call the Department of Justice, and you say, look, this is what we know. This is what we don't know. We know that we get credit if we come in and blow the whistle on ourselves early on, because we obviously don't want to have any of this stuff going on. We've got a rogue employee in China. He's putting the whole company at risk. We want to minimize our exposure, right? These are some of the most difficult judgment calls that lawyers and boards of directors have to make together, right? And the issue very often is, when is the evidence strong enough? Because many of these situations, I got to tell you, it's all right. It smells like a rat, but is it really a rat? We don't know.
And so give me maybe a couple of constructive, as you always put it, takeaway pointers for directors who hear what you just said and I think are probably nodding their heads at the screen. So let me give an example and tell me if it's right or wrong, or if there's a better version. It seems to me when you have an inkling of something, you need to engage counsel or engage investigation or engage outside counsel, independent counsel to get a sense of it. So expand on yes, no, and how so. Give me a version of that.
I wish there were a formula.
Okay.
All of these situations are very situational. And in 90% of these situations, as more facts come to the table, you'll always look in hindsight and go, I reported
you should have. Yeah.
I reported too soon. I reported too late. So one of the first things that I do when I talk to people about this situation, I say, look, whatever we do, it's going to be wrong. In hindsight, nobody ever gets this 100% right at this stage. Let's map through what are the consequences if we get it wrong by going in too soon. What are the consequences if we get it wrong by going in too late? What are the consequences if we should bring more resources in and we don't? What are the consequences if we bring more resources? And we have no good choices.
And who's the board having that conversation with, Joe? Just themselves, or do you recommend, under certain circumstances, other expertise?
Well, typically, when the company is large enough, you have the conversations, general counsel and lawyers, and then you brief the board. All right, so you start, all right, lawyer, all right, how are we going to handle it that way? And then you say to the board, this is where we are, this is the situation, you know, here's how we're going to do it. You know, either we are going to self-report, we're not going to self-report. You know, we think we need to go to the investors and we think this actually was fraud and we may need to reprice the last round. We think there was fraud and we're going to go to the SEC and the Department of Justice. And oh, by the way, we're looking for a new CEO. We think I mean, so all of these, I mean, if there was a formula, I'd put it up on the board and they'd make all of you memorize it. There's no formula.
So I'm gonna ask you to throw us a bone. Give us a storyline where you think directors should become more attentive. Is there a pattern that, again, it's all contextual, but is there some sort of pattern? So I'll give you an example. I'm imagining this. I don't have any, and I don't think anyone has any firsthand information except for the individuals themselves. But let us imagine that over time, the trade secret versus patent strategy began to make the board of Theranos anxious, and some wanted to understand the trade secret structure better or more, or just get more details, and that was refused. At some point, you would imagine that in an executive session, a double bubble executive session with just the board, someone would say, "I'm a little anxious about this. What do you think?" And so is that the point at which people's antennas should have gone up? Or like, what? Give us something to anchor to so that we can have people's experience be useful.
In the Theranos situation, I think everybody's antennas should have gone up on day one. I mean, it's like, what are you doing here? I mean, come on, all right? So that, and to explain Theranos, I think you have to look at the broader. It's almost like an anthropological exercise. You have to look at the tribe that was created around Elizabeth, and the thing is, it was always at a certain level in everybody's self-interest to believe what she was saying. And one of the things that we know about frauds, and unfortunately I know too much about frauds, is the easiest fraud to pull off is the one where you're telling somebody something they want to hear. See? So, Dan, if I want to steal your money, all right, it's best if I know that you're interested in X.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great, Dan, that's great. I'm interested in X too. Isn't that really wonderful? Wouldn't it be great? You go, wouldn't it be great if? And I go, yeah, it would. And by the way, let me introduce you to the person who can do that. Great. I mean, that's one of the simplest formulas for a fraud, right? And in the,
go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and in this case, what we have is people believing, my goodness, we have a 19-year-old, very, very appealing dropout from Stanford who's going to solve a major healthcare problem that can bend the cost curve, make the world a better place, and save lives. Who doesn't want to believe that? Who doesn't want to get behind that and help that mission succeed? And oh, by the way, if we do that, we'll all get unbelievably rich and we'll be able to feel very good about ourselves. And we'll all have the social status that comes along with being on a board of directors with Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and all of these other luminaries. Why in the world wouldn't I want to make this work?
And so when you're ways down that path, I think it's good to invoke an author named Heffernan. She has a book that's been out for a while called Willful Blindness. I'm just building on your dynamic. When you have a lot of reasons to want to believe, but then when you grow anxious, I think it's referred to as the foundational card in the house of cards. If the thing that you are trying not to believe, that is the thing going wrong, is the foundation, and everything comes tumbling down. People, normal, honest, hardworking people are resistant to seeing that, right? Because if it's the thing that, causes everything to collapse, you just kind of don't want to believe it. So what is a strategy for directors to have a clearer eye about this kind of thing? And it doesn't have to be the Theranos example because it's so exaggerated as to almost not be productive. But are there other ways in which directors can have a clearer view about what's really happening and not just the appropriate encouragement and wishful thinking that everything's going to go well?
My answer to that is a bumper sticker that I saw not long ago. And it was like, as you could imagine, on an old VW bus, right? Back when bumper stickers were really good. And the bumper sticker said, "Don't believe everything you think." Right? So maintaining an appropriate, right, you finally got it, right?
Took me a second.
So maintaining an appropriate sense of skepticism and being able to look at the world through a rational person's eyes, right, is a critically important skill, I think, not only for a lawyer to have, but also for every director to have. I mean, this is what our CEO is telling us. This is what I'm hearing. This is what we're saying inside the boardroom. But are we smoking our own dope here? Right? What would this look like, to a rational third-party outsider? You always have to maintain that level of objectivity. But again, I respect the fact that it can be very hard to do, especially in a situation where it's in your best interests to believe that something else is true. That's human nature.
And I think it might have been Cy Loren who coined this phrase, cooperative skepticism, right, as opposed to antagonistic skepticism. And it has, in a boardroom, you might hear something like, in the interest of thoroughness, let me ask a follow-up question, right? Which is a tough question. It's a skeptical question, but it's not meant to derail per se. It's actually meant to push the management or the CEO to really defend their position, to understand and to explain to the board that they understand, right? And so I like this idea of cooperative skepticism, because you don't want an antagonistic board, obviously, but at the same time, you don't want to push overboard. So I have that. Speaking of boards, we've gotten a couple of questions, and it was in our queue to ask, and I'm going to expand the question, which was, hey, what do you think about the qualifications of the Theranos board? What about, scientific expertise and the like? I'd like to expand that a bit and have you comment. I think most people appreciate what the Theranos board did not bring to the table in terms of expertise, but maybe compare that with Headspin. I mean, did they have an advantage? Like, were they a better qualified board for the purposes of what they were doing, and hence that's why they performed better? Or was it something else? So maybe comment on your thoughts on the Theranos board, but tie it to Headspin.
Well, so, with regard to the Headspin stuff is simpler.
Much.
You faked some sales invoices. I mean, wait a minute. Do we really have the invoice? No, we don't. How come we don't? Well, I forged it. Okay, that's not hard to understand. Now, at a certain level, well, we have machines that do this. Do they really do? I mean, there's a way to figure out, all right, whether they really do or don't. But let's stipulate that it's a level of complexity higher than, hey, I documented some invoices. Nonetheless, from my perspective, if you're going to be on a board, you should be able to figure that out. Look, Sagan's law. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Elizabeth was making extraordinary claims, all right, and where was her proof? And that's the kind of stuff that just makes me, makes my head spin. How about that?
Yeah, Joe does, and I think that it's interesting that apparently the Theranos board, even lacking certain type of credentialed experience, didn't ask harder questions, because sometimes not having the expertise gives you room to ask harder questions. You can always consult experts. So why didn't that happen? Like, why wouldn't they have just asked harder questions?
So look, I don't think it's fair to say that none of them ever asked harder questions.
Okay.
I think the evidence might be that some of them asked harder questions and they got lied to. And then the follow-up question is, well, should you have been able to figure out that you were lied to? And were your questions hard enough? And did you go at it strongly enough over time? So, I don't know that it's entirely accurate to say that nobody asked a hard question. But when they asked the hard question, did they follow up appropriately? Should they have understood that they were being lied to? Where does this leave?
So, Joe, what advice do you give then to people contemplating joining a board? Right? I mean, it's such a universal failure. Should they not join boards in which they think that they're? Yeah. So give some thoughts on this.
So look, the answer is, when you're joining a board, you got to ask yourself, why am I here? Right? What am I adding to the governance mix so that it's valuable to other people to have me in the room? Right? If you are a technology expert, the space, that's why you're there. Terrific. All right. Well, you better bring your technology chops to the table. If you're a finance expert and you know the space, terrific. Bring your finance chops. If you're a legal expert, great. Bring your legal expertise. If you're looking and say, oh, the only reason why I'm here is because I'm a pretty face, gears got to grind. Then the other thing you got to do is you got to look around the room and you got to say, wait a minute. A board of directors is typically a portfolio of skills, and you need the right mix. So it's like an orchestra. If everybody's an oboe player, you're going to have an interesting time with Beethoven's violin concerto. All right? You need an appropriate mix of skills that's suited to the challenge that faces the company. So if you don't have that appropriate skill mix, and if you're not really clear about the value that you're adding and that value add is really material, you probably don't belong in the room.
So can you expand the analysis around like the board power and what they should be doing in light of controlling interest by founders? So let's identify the perfect storm. So it's charismatic, controlling interest, cutting edge technology that really is hard to discern. So you've got reasonableness in there. Like, what do you do?
Well, at some point, if you're not persuaded, you leave, you resign from the board. All right. You sort of say, wait a minute, the CEO's got total control. The CEO can vote me off the board. All right. The only influence I have is the ability to persuade. And if I have fundamental issues, if I'm not persuaded, and if I can't persuade other people about these fundamental issues, then the right thing for me to do is basically to leave. It's like the military. All right. Your superior gives you an officer. You can either an order. It's a legal order. You can either follow the order or resign. You don't really have the right to say, no, I'm not going to follow that order. It's the same conundrum.
So in that circumstance, what if you suspect a fraud and you're an independent director, but you're in a controlled company with a charismatic founder? What I know it depends and it's complicated, but if you suspect a fraud.
Well, ideally, what you do is you take it up within channels first. All right. So number one, if you suspect a fraud, you got to be very, very, very factual. Right. You don't want to talk to anybody about your spidey sense. What you want to do is you want to say, look, fact A, fact B, fact C, they don't line up. All right. One of the reasons why they might not line up is we may be dealing with a fraud over here. I'd like some assurance that's not the problem that we've got. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Some people have personalities such that as soon as you raise that question, even if you're entirely right, they're going to react badly. They're not going to try to explain that there isn't an issue. They're going to say, you don't have any confidence in me. How dare you even ask this question? All right. You're impugning my integrity. I don't want to have anything more to do with you. All right. And the interesting thing about those situations is sometimes there really is no fraud. And the person, takes an affront. And in other situations, yeah, it's a fraud. You smoked it out and the guy just doesn't want to answer your questions. This is another one of these situations where life stinks. All right. And you're going to have to make the decision. How firm are you in your concern about it? And if you're not comfortable with the answers that you're getting, then you got to go. All right. And then reverse engineering, the emotional dimension of this. In some situations, you can predict that simply by raising the question, you're going to sufficiently antagonize the willful, headstrong, ego-driven CEO to such a point that that you've just ended your time with the company. Okay.
Right? Which is an important point, right? So oddly, or maybe it's not odd, your fiduciary duty under certain circumstances requires that you probably take steps that start a countdown clock in terms of your ability to remain on the board. Now, in the process, you might suss out something very valuable, and that's great, or you might not. And either way.
And the other thing is you typically want to talk to the company's lawyer.
Okay.
Right. You have to, at the beginning at this stage, you keep it in the tent.
Yeah. Right. We've gotten some great questions. I want to encourage people to keep sending the questions in, and I'm kind of trying to weave them in a little bit, but I got one that's kind of just separate. I can't weave it in easily. And that was, there's a question to you, Joe, that said, in light of your conversations related to Theranos with Elizabeth, at what point, what would she have had to do to make you report something? That's actually a pretty technically complicated legal question, I know. So you're not on the board, you never joined the board, but she's talking to you and you end up with these deep concerns, right? At what point does that become actionable in your opinion, if at all?
Well, I'll give you my guess. All right, and this is totally speculative. Don't anybody take this to the bank. Had I been foolish enough to join the board, and especially against my bride's advice, which, that would be an act of suicide, all right? If I had joined the board, and if these questions still hadn't been answered after all, I probably just would have resigned. I probably would have done what Mike Esquivel did, because I wouldn't think that I knew enough to be able to say there really was a fraud going on here. I knew enough to know that I wasn't getting, think back to what I said. I can't say that she ever lied to me. I will say that I asked many questions to which I did not get a straight answer. I can't say that what she said was a lie. All right. So that's very different from the Headspin situation where, you sold them $1,500 worth of services and the invoice says $150,000.
Right.
Oh, it's typo. It's just a little dot. It was just a little, it's just a little dot. Oh, okay.
For my part, if you'd been on the Theranos board, I suspect you would have resigned, but probably you would have asked some well-placed questions beforehand that would have caused other directors to resign with you, and maybe it would have been a very different story.
No. You're then giving me far too much credit, and you're not understanding the extraordinary power of FOMO, fear of missing out.
Sure.
All right, because if you would have believed what I believed, you then miss out on the millions and millions and millions of dollars that you could have made in this. Huge financial reason to back Elizabeth and to believe what she is believing.
And that brings us back a little bit to the dilemma of board culture, right? So you can have strong cultures, you can have productive boards. One element of a productive, highly functional board is a cohesiveness. Now, sometimes that verges into a strong desire for consensus, which then has a dark side, right? Which can be something like, squashing, minority voices and the like. And so one question is from a board culture viewpoint, Joe, how do you encourage, and this is a question that we received, how do you encourage an environment that strikes the right balance, right? So that there's not such a desire for consensus and this FOMO, right? Especially in VC-backed boards, high growth private companies, you have a strong desire for success, and you might have that board culture. How do you strike a better balance as a board so that you will hear people out, even for speculative items that are a little bit more complicated?
What can I say? This reminds me a little bit about the formula for running a good sushi restaurant. Right, so what does your question have to do with fish?
I want to know.
Yeah, the answer very simply is the secret for success at a good sushi restaurant is get the best ingredients, present them as cleanly as possible, and just get out of the way. If you've got the right people on the board, if you've got the right ingredients, if you've got people with the right experience, background, and character, you will typically need to do nothing in order to get to the right result. Now, if you've got a bunch of people on the board that are in a certain sense compromised, all right, then you're going to run into situations where there's nothing that you can do, right, to get these people to the right conclusion. All right. So in many of these circumstances, what I observe is you can pretty much tell how it's going to turn out if you know enough about the character of the people. And very often, so suppose you've got a board with N people. I won't make up any, I could use names, I won't. Where you've got like N people, I'll just make up a number, say 9 people. Right? You can have a situation where if you've got 3, right, people who are just really there and they form a block, they can then explain to other people who are more compromised about what needs to be done. Much harder for 1, possible more difficult for 2. You get to 3, and then it really becomes hard to ignore at that point. All right. And again, there's lots of studies and the whole bit. But that in many ways, the most powerful variable in this situation is the character of the individuals. What are the ingredients? If you've got the right ingredients, it's going to work. If you got the wrong ingredients, it can be very tough.
And though I know it's a different conversation, we've covered it a fair bit, it strikes me that it has some intersection with diversity. So, with pretty good ingredients, but a homogenous set, I think you're less likely to get the description you made, which is you don't want just one, you want hopefully two, hopefully three people who see it from a different angle and can kind of bring things up. So I just mentioned that because I think that's a part of that. I just
look, diversity has no stronger champion than I.
No, I know.
But I don't think that this and diversity are deeply connected.
Well, they're connected a little, though. Although you may disagree, but I think they are a little bit connected in that, in achieving a diverse board, you achieve a board that has empowered members to probably ask a wider range of questions. Has probably allowed a little bit more time for more fulsome discussion because you have a variety of different viewpoints. I think you have some greater odds of having an environment in which you have a wider range of give and take in the conversational process of cooperative skepticism. Now, my experience is a fraction of yours, so you can argue differently, and I would just have to say maybe I've been lucky in the boards that I've been on.
No, look, when people talk about diversity, right, in these situations, it's often gender and ethnicity and race and the like, and it's easy. I'm not going to name names or what have you. It's very easy to find situations of massive frauds where the boards arguably didn't do what they should have done, where you've got a large number of women on the board. And it's easy to find situations where boards did exactly the right thing. They hit the ball out of the park, and it's a bunch of, old, bald, white guys like me. Okay? So there are many, many, many excellent, superb reasons to diversify boards of publicly traded and privately held corporations. But the idea that diversification will help reduce headspin-like situations or Theranos situations, I think that's pressing the diversity button harder than it should be pressed.
All right, we'll put a pin in it. We'll come back to it. I agree about the headspin. I don't agree about the Theranos. I think a more diverse board in many ways might have made a big difference on Theranos. Might have made a very big difference.
A diverse board, I'll just tell you something. If you had a diverse board with more old, bald, white guys like me that ask questions the way that I do, all right, it would have, by the way, it would have been easy to have, more women on the board that would have been huge Elizabeth fans and wouldn't have asked probing questions. I think these issues are, as we like to say in the academic business, orthogonal to
orthogonal. All right, that's fair. That's fair. I just sent you a question that was posed to us, which is sort of technical, but we've got a bunch of them that are of this flavor that goes something like, if you are on a board and you're not having the persuasive effect you would hope to have, and facts are stacking up that point to fraud, and yet you're maybe still in that kind of gray area. There's a bunch of questions, and the one I sent you kind of highlights them, but there's some others, and I'll raise it so that other people can hear it. What if there's collusive fraud with the complicity of another board director, right? Or in light of the fact that leaving may or may not actually absolve a director of liability, and D&O policies have something to say about that, right? How do you think about that? Like, what's the right way to think about it? And then a couple of questions that go from, should you resign? Does that protect you better? Or are you better off really prompting the special investigation and trying to see it through? And I know the first and biggest answer is it really depends on the context to get professional advice. But putting that aside, Joe, what would you suggest to think about for these folks?
Again, these situations are always so facts and circumstances based. And there are situations in which you could even imagine the facts and circumstances being identical, but the personalities of the directors being different. One director having a greater willingness to engage in a potentially litigation-prone situation. Another director saying, look, I'm at a stage in life where the last thing in the world I want is litigation exposure. Well, I would give different advice to those two people. you could come to me with the same set of facts that would say, look, here's the risk that our CEO is pulling off, a headspin type fraud. All right. And let's assume that I am counsel to the individual director. Well, this could lead to litigation. Here's your potential exposure, what have you. Here are the upsides and downsides. It's a little bit like COVID decisions. There's risk in whatever you do. We can't take the risk off the table. Here's one set of risks and returns if we follow this path, there's no guarantee. Here's another set of risks and returns if we follow a different path, there's no guarantee. So you could imagine one person saying, fine, I'll take these risks. I think it's important to see it through. And I go, okay, then here's the optimal strategy for implementing that approach. And then you can have another guy that says, why do I want this in my life now? Great. Let's walk away. Here's the smartest way for you to walk away. All right. So I think, part of the art here is the decision can be subjective. But once you make that decision, execute well, right? If you're a baseball player, if you want to swing for the fences, this is how you do it. If you want to bunt, this is how you do it. But if you're confused about whether you're swinging for the fences or bunting, nothing good is going to happen.
So, Joe, that's actually a nice segue to the question we just received about the nose in, fingers out philosophy. But let me enhance it by just saying, so we know that in public boards, right, the nose in, fingers out is a strong imperative. You don't want CEO experience brought to the board as independent director and act like the CEO. That's not helpful. But on the other hand, there's private equity models that really, I would call it nose in, pre-approved, fingers in, right? Because sometimes that board is much more involved and it's much more direct and it's a different model. And then of course you have VC funded private companies, which is kind of a different beast into itself. So the question was posed specifically, do you think that the nose in, fingers out model still holds for directors, or is Theranos perhaps the case in point that you need something more from directors and not just nose in and fingers out in order to confront these types of problems?
If your nose is in and if you smell excrement, you can't keep your fingers out. All right, you got to do something. All right, now, if your nose is in and you're not sure, it smells a little funky, if you know what I mean, but you're not, and this is life. Life is, it's got a funky aroma. All right, you don't really know for certain it is, and typically what happens is it's a funky aroma. How do we find out what's generating that smell? I wish that smell weren't there. Hey, Dan, do you smell that? Yeah, I think I do. What is it? I'm not really sure. All right, is there a dead rat in that cupboard, or is that just the Camembert cheese? Well, you want to open the cupboard and find out? I don't know. I'm afraid I'll find a rat. That's the dynamic in many of these situations.
But you probably got to open the cupboard. Yeah. At that point, there's two of you. Think it's a rat. Might be cheese, but think it's a rat. You got to open the cupboard.
I'm an open the cupboard kind of guy.
Okay. Yeah. Or ask someone to open the cupboard.
I know other people that would put a lock on the cupboard. You don't want to know. Let's just agree. It could be cheese, and therefore let's agree it smells like cheese, not like a dead rat.
But we can all agree that we wouldn't want that director on our board. We'd prefer the cautious check with other directors. If you all think it might be a rat, but it could be cheese, politely and kindly open the cupboard.
I tell you, the kinds of organizations I'd like to that I do deal with, and I'm willing to continue to deal with, is you never even get that smell. People come to you and say, oh, by the way, 3 conferences rooms down, we thought we smelled something. We came in, we fumigated. Yeah, we found a dead rat, but it's fumigated and it's gone. And this is what we've done.
So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I want to ask two questions. One is going back to this idea of stakeholders and responsible parties. LPs, who are the investors in these funds, who in turn are investors in these types of companies. Theranos is a little bit different in some ways, but do you think the landscape and expectations has changed around the behavior of the directors who ultimately serve on these boards. It's a little attenuated, mind you, but so you have funds, and the funds are under certain circumstances placing directors, independent or otherwise, and you have the large investors behind those funds. Has Theranos or Headspin or anything else changed the expectation that investors, LPs in particular, have about what funds and in the end directors should be doing on these boards, do you think?
Well, I don't know that the mechanism of action really runs that strongly through the LPs. I think what happens is, people learn by example. And now no VC wants to be like somebody who's been on the Theranos board.
Right.
And VCs now have the example of Headspin. And in my experience, a story is worth 1,000 times a theory. And in my conversations with people in these situations have really been able to transform. They've been transformed because of the Theranos and Headspin situations. I use these as two examples.
Yeah.
And prior to Theranos, these are always really difficult questions to have, conversations to have, because people say, well, give me an example. Tell me what happened. It's all theory. All right, but now it's really concrete. You want to be like the board in Theranos, or do you want to be like the board in Headspin? Let's talk about this. Here are two situations. All right, now in neither situation is any director going to jail.
Right.
Right. But
reputationally, it's a sad end for some of those directors.
Oh, right? Yeah. Reputationally, it's a sad end. And how do you want your VC firm to be viewed? All right, with regard to how you handle this situation. And look, there's some situations where firms will say, look, let's just let the company fail. Let's not go report to the auditor, to the authorities, or let's try to handle this situation as quietly as we can. All right, let's go to the new investors and say, look, we understand there's an issue in the whole bit. You invested at a valuation of 500 million. We've looked at these numbers. We understand. We'll give you some additional shares of stock. All right, here you go. We'll get this resolved. You quietly exit the CEO. All right, the CEO decides he wants to spend more time with his family. He's a bachelor, but he's going to spend more time with his family. Okay.
Parents need attention too.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, right. He has a terrarium. His turtle is lonely. Okay. He's spending more time. All right. Quality terrarium time. Great. So there's situations that get navigated that way. We're not going to the authorities. We will make it good with the investors. We will move the CEO along, all right, and we'll try to do our best to save the company without anybody going to jail. That's another way that some people try to navigate the situation.
And so let me ask you the final question, which what you just described is sort of a good setup for that. If you had to name one element of justice being pointedly served in both narratives, either narrative, and one element of justice just not being served, what would it be if you picked one of each? It could be either from Headspin or Theranos.
All right, Dan, you define justice, and I'll then answer.
No, that's the thing. No, that's right, because both of these stories, Theranos more so, obviously, inflame people's curiosity, passions, reactions, and a lot of people invoke kind of justice. There's sometimes outrage about who did or didn't go to jail, and so on and so forth. So I'm from your perspective. So it's your definition of justice. I'm very interested in one on each end.
There are multiple definitions. At one level, a whole bunch of people lost a whole bunch of money, and at one level, that was justice because they should have been able to figure out that if I could do the due diligence, all right, and why wouldn't you be able to do the due diligence? Right? If you were stupid enough to go on this board and couldn't figure out what the challenge is, I shouldn't say stupid. If you went on this board and you assumed the risk and it wound up going against you, well, it's justice that you're taking a reputational hit at that level.
Okay.
Right? So you could say it a certain, and Elizabeth Holmes should go to jail, and hopefully she'll go to jail for a longer time than many people think. All right. Sunny Balwani, in my view, should also go to jail. All right. There's a criminal prosecution against the former CEO. All right, at Headspin, he should also go to jail. All right, so and I'm not talking about virtual jail. I'm talking about
actual prison. Yeah,
actually, actual prison. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So,
all right, that's fair.
Yeah,
that's a good answer. No, that's a legitimate answer. I was just curious as to your feelings. You're so good at not really revealing what you thought the punchline should be. I really wanted to just kind of tease it out. You get last word for 30 seconds on this observation before I bring Nancy back to point us to some future resources, one of which is Directors College, by the way. But you last word for 30 seconds on takeaways for directors.
The opening line of Anna Karenina is that all happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And in my experience, each of these situations where you run into this kind of a potential fraud involving a CEO, and you've clearly crossed the line between what people like to say is fake it until you make it, right? And you're giving out false blood tests and you're doctoring up, they're all different. They're all like, and the boards involved in these situations, they're unhappy families, always. And again, as Tolstoy writes, unhappy families, each in their own way. So each one of these situations has to be approached uniquely with respect for the personalities, the emotions, and the situations, and an understanding that there is no one size fits all, and that in many circumstances, you need to engineer a resolution that fits both the facts and the personalities. If you get these situations factually correct, but emotionally wrong, it'll blow up. If you get it emotionally correct and factually wrong, it'll blow up. You got to get the personalities and the realities all aligned. And I got to say, sometimes that's just not possible, given the way some people are wired. That's just not going to work. Good luck to you.
That's a great pep talk to serving on boards, especially startup boards. But with that in mind, let's give you some head start tools to do better if you chose that path. So first, Joe, thank you, but don't hop off because I think Nancy's great. Mentioned a couple things, but Joe, it is always a pleasure to talk to you, and I know your time is so valuable. So thank you for spending time answering questions. Yeah, Nancy, it's to you, and I think you're going to mention Directors College if I'm not wrong.
Indeed. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Joe. Always appreciate your time and your perspective. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I did want to make a quick plug for Stanford's Directors College. Joe and his team at the Rock Center always put on a fantastic program. This year it's June 19th through the 21st, and currently it is scheduled to be in person at Stanford University. So I encourage you to check that out. It's www.directorscollege.com. I will send out the link in an email to all that registered for this webinar. Highly recommend it. It's a great program. Both Dan and Joe have been involved for years, and I can personally say it's one of the premier education programs for directors. Additionally, if you missed the SVDX program in January, we had Professor of Criminal Law Bob Weisberg, who actually talked about the Theranos trial with Elizabeth Holmes from a criminal law perspective. So that webinar is recorded and is on our website, svdx.org, if you want to check that out. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. Joe, thank you again, and hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
It's great seeing you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.